And for that, I would like to invite to the stage Bel Parnell, an independent researcher and one of our editors here at Esomar, to take you to this journey. Welcome, Belle.
All right. Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining me here for this session on inclusive writing in MR. Some of you might actually know me if you've submitted a paper for Congress or a recent SMR event. Chances are I actually edited it, so we might have had email contact and been in touch about your paper. So it's nice to meet you and be with you here today, and to also have the opportunity to see those papers brought to life here at Congress. A little bit about me for some context. Alongside editing for Esomar and for various scholars, I'm also a researcher myself, looking at discourse and thinking about how various discourses shape and influence how we understand belonging and identity. I'm a part of the European Race and Imagery Foundation, which is an anti-racism organization. And we also curate content, we do our own market research and build communities. And yeah, of course, I'm an editor, as I've already said. So now that you have a bit of background on where I'm coming from and what my interests are professionally, it brings me to talk about why I'm here today and why I wanted to do this session. In the last year or so, I've noticed a really significant and inspiring shift in market research as I've been editing for Esomar. And yeah, it's really inspiring to see how DEI topics are coming into market research more and more, both in terms of what's being focused on from a campaign point of view, but also the sensitivity and the consciousness that those topics are being treated with by the research industry. But that's not to say, wait a minute. That's not to say that we're not lagging behind and that there isn't, there aren't sometimes areas where there could be improvement, and that's something I really pick up on as an editor and also as a discourse analyst looking at these papers. So that's something I've been thinking about. And I've also been thinking along what are the business ramifications and the societal ramifications when the wording that's used in these research papers isn't always appropriate or doesn't actually serve the intentions that the researchers might have. And I'm not alone in thinking about this. So some of you yesterday might have caught Anneke Quinn de Jong's presentation on brand responsibility and reputation, where she's talking about how brands can be leaders in shaping and changing conversations and leading the way in thinking about how we talk about specific issues, how we connect with audiences and consumers, and how that can lead to really concrete business outcomes. And it's not only within the industry, the market research industry, that we are having these conversations. So alongside the other tasks I mentioned, I'm also a part of the Race in the Marketplace network. And one of my colleagues there, Guillaume Johnson, his research has been looking at apologies by brands. And so specifically, if a brand puts out a campaign that's racist, how do they respond? And he's really looked at the wording of those responses or apologies to think about how that produces or reproduces a certain social reality. So you can see two different approaches to thinking about wording in campaigns, or indeed in response to campaigns, and how that shapes society, but also how that can impact business. So what role does research have in that, if we think about that as their kind of end point in this whole process? I would say that market researchers have a very important, significant role in informing ad campaigns, and we need to therefore be more specific and intentional in the language that we use. And that's the thing, when I say I feel like there's something lacking sometimes in the papers that I edit, it's that intention and that specificity that's missing. So I have a couple of examples to really demonstrate what I mean and where I see that coming across, and in order to also show how this could be implemented better. So I want to introduce you to the genderbread person who is already aware of this creature. Oh, wow, okay, that's cool. That's really, really cool. So this is a really nice infographic, and you can see there's like 4 elements that are really highlighted. There's, of course, attraction, the love heart, and expression. But I really wanted to focus on gender identity, the brain, so who we know ourselves to be, and sex, which is basically body parts in this context. Because we see gender terms and sex terms being used interchangeably a lot in research papers. So quite often, man and woman being used interchangeably with male and female, even though they don't necessarily mean the same thing. We're talking about population segmentations, and we're talking about male and female. That doesn't necessarily mean the same as man and woman. So this is really important for us to pay attention to, because there's an opportunity here to really relate more strongly to our communities and our potential consumers when we get that wording right and when we actually say what we mean, rather than assuming and implying that male always means man and that female always means woman. And what about the categories in between and around? So intersex, non-binary, and beyond. Those are often missing from research papers, and the vocabulary used there when we talk in terms of gender and or sex. So it would be really good to see some more terminologies being used in that way. Another topic perhaps comes up less than the gender sex one, but it's coming more and more, especially post 2020, as we're having more conversations about race, diversity, ethnicity. And of course, ethnicity is very relevant when we think about different demographics and how they're attracted to different types of products. Often we're seeing racial categories and racial terminologies being used, again, interchangeably with ethnic categories when they don't exactly mean the same thing. And sometimes racial categories are very flattening. They're a bit too broad to actually say what they mean, and they carry a lot of connotations that might not actually relate to the intentions of the campaign or the researcher. And so ethnicity or ethnicity-based terms might actually be more specific, give more meaning, more richness to what the researcher wants to say. So for an example, I wanted to refer to ketikoti. I'm not sure how many of you know what ketikoti is or what it relates to. Yeah, a few show of hands. There will be people that are really based in the Netherlands that will have heard of it. Ketikoti means breaking of chains in Surinamese, and it refers to a specific commemoration we have here in the Netherlands every year for the end of enslavement in Suriname, which was a former Dutch colony. It's very similar to Juneteenth. Who's heard of Juneteenth? Okay, slightly more people. So it's a similar type of thing. And it relates to a very specific history that connects to a very specific diaspora in the Netherlands. It has, of course, the potential to galvanize all Dutch people or all people living in the Netherlands, and it does. The festivals and ceremonies for ketikoti are always very diverse, and it's a very beautiful moment. But at the same time, to truly understand what ketikoti is about, you have to talk about the specific history of the Afro-Dutch Surinamese population and the diaspora. And so you see the difference. You can't just say, oh, ketikoti is a black Dutch thing. In order to truly understand what it is, you have to be more specific and use more specific language. And that will potentially be able to generate a much richer more intentional campaign as well if you're marketing such a campaign and using the terms more carefully and more consciously. There's a lot more that I could say. There's so many more examples as I have here. We could be more careful and caring in terms of how we talk about class and age. We need to all be so much more conscientious about ableist language and how that worms its way into so much of what we do and how we write. We could be so much more conscientious about using terms like Western and developing. Do those terms really serve what we think they do? Do they mean what we want them to mean in this day? I've touched on heteronormativity, but there's so many more directions we could go with that conversation, and I'd love to in the discussion I hope we're going to have. And also English. I'm at a really international event, and all of the papers for Congress, they come from all over the world, and that's amazing. But sometimes when they're written by Anglophone writers, there's a lot of very colloquial, local language, and that creates this very inside joker kind of tone in those papers. We want to be part of a global, diverse, international conversation. We want to invite people in to know about our research. We need to be mindful of the language we're using and make sure it's accessible. So yeah, and it doesn't have to only start when we're writing up our results and when we're preparing for Congress. It can be already, it should already be at the stage where we're designing the research itself, that we really think about it. When we're going out and we're targeting populations to participate in the research, we should already be thinking then about the words that we use, because it's going to influence the data we collect and generate, it's going to influence how we analyze that data, and it's going to influence the stories we tell, that our partners and clients tell, and the reach we're able to have. So yeah, I'll stop there. Hopefully there's time and inspiration for discussion and questions. But I just want to thank you for being here and listening and for including me here today. Thank you.
While you're thinking about your questions, I do have a few.
Okay.
You mentioned ableist language.
Uh-huh.
What does that necessarily entail, and explain to the public what that actually means?
Well, I can give an example. I can hear myself, that's weird. A really good example that might not occur to many people, might even get a few eye rolls, but that's okay, is a term like paralyzed. So we see that come up like when there is a moment of indecision or overwhelming amount of data, or you see it used very colloquially. Our team was paralyzed. But I read an article not so long ago by a lecturer who is actually in a wheelchair, so actually is paralyzed. And he was explaining in this article, when I come across someone saying that and they're absolutely not paralyzed, it makes me shut down and it makes me check out of the conversation, whatever it's about. And the reason is because the person is using this term that relates to my very existence and being in a way that is not actually accurate, because it means the person's indecisive, or that the person is confused, or that the person is misinformed. It doesn't actually mean that they cannot move or that they need help to move. And that's actually how it should be used. So it's about, what I'm saying about ableism is we need to be really caring and careful, because we don't know who's coming into contact with our research and how they're going to be shut out of that conversation. And also, indeed, if you put that wording into your report and you send it to your ad team, maybe it ends up in a campaign, and how many, if we want to be really kind of cynical about it, how many consumers might you lose? Because they're also thinking, oh, well, they don't understand my existence if they're using this term in this way.
Thank you very much. Does anyone in the audience have any questions? I'll come your way.
Thanks. Thank you. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask a question about heteronormativity and how you see this showing up in more subtle or more obvious ways. and what you think is a good way to approach that, improving that, when gender isn't a main focus of the paper, but comes up in passing in sort of relation to maybe talking about households or things like that.
I'm glad that you mentioned households, because that's absolutely a key place where I see it come up in papers that I'm editing, talking about households, in taking for granted that there is a mum, a dad, or, that there's always a mum and a dad rather than two dads or two mums or single parents or maybe multiple parents, blended families. There's still a very kind of traditional setup that's presented when we talk about households and household consumption papers, or papers around parenthood, for example. It's very kind of clear, and again, the implication might be that we're talking about men and women having families together, but male and female is being used as well. So there's not a lot of room there thinking about other identities, other gender identities or gender expressions. What was the second part of your question again?
I think you actually answered it. It was about sort of like subtle versus obvious ways that this might come up when it's not, and also when it's in passing and it's not the focus of the paper.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess in terms of how we can counter that, kind of comes back to what I was saying about being really intentional and specific. So obviously thinking and being aware that there are other family types, other household types that are not, mum, dad, two kids and a dog. But, beyond that, if we're talking about, let's say, if it's a research that is about motherhood, for it to be inclusive, do we need to always imagine that a mother is a woman? I will let that settle, but the two things are just immediately put together, and that's not necessarily the case. And I'm not talking about men that have a papadag or a daddy day, as we say in the Netherlands. I mean, is every mother, person that gives birth, person that stays home, a woman? And does that person always see themselves as a woman? And therefore, should that word be used in that context?
Thanks very much.
Anyone else have any questions? A couple actually have come in through the app.
Oh.
Yes. One of them is, isn't it counterintuitive to be so specific when you're trying to actually talk about diversity?
To be so, yeah. You could argue that, yes, but actually I would say no. Because I think when you just have this broad stroke approach, you leave so much room for ambiguity and assumptions that are harmful. And it's actually the potential harmful ideas that are exclusionary. So you may think, oh, if we're vague, then that means we have a bigger reach. But it can just leave a lot of room for error and a lot of room for, negative perceptions, instead of being very clear, giving context about what you mean. And I think the other side of that is, if you're very specific in your target and you tell a very rich story because you're so intentional, that story will resonate with people and audiences that you didn't even necessarily realize you would reach, because you're telling something that just feels real rather than something that's kind of cobbled and thrown together.
Makes perfect sense. One last question, and I think it's more of a tip that you can give the audience and those watching at home. How do you know when you're actually not using the right language?
I think it's about being willing to engage beyond your comfort zone and to inform yourself and educate yourself. And we're all researchers, so that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so if you are going to have a campaign and you do want to, for instance, reach people that you consider to be disabled, then you need to do your due diligence and make sure that language would not be, especially in that case, ableist. but in general, just kind of thinking about all the different forms of oppression that we have in the world, and then thinking, okay, if I want to avoid reproducing that oppression, what kind of ways do I need to be communicating in order to ensure that the conversation is as horizontalized and respectful as possible? And yeah, that's an investment, but I think if we, not just from a business point of view, but as social leaders, if we want to make the world a better place, then it is an investment we need to be making.
Thank you very much, Belle. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.